Well, good morning, Father. Thank you for joining us in our show. This is The Drawing Flame. We take that from a poem of Gerard Manley Hopkins. You may know the poem, As Kingfishers Catch Fire, Dragonflies Draw Flame, which is the image we've kind of tried to capture of, right, Hopkins, as Hopkins is only able to do, paints this beautiful scene of dragonflies flying at sunset, and kind of the jewel tones of their wings are iridescent under the sunlight, and kingfishers are flying about trying to catch them and eat them. But we also think it's a beautiful image of the Holy Spirit, the flame in the wilderness guiding the people of God, wandering about, trying to find their way to Canaan. So, maybe just a place to start would be, as we think about how the Lord kind of sometimes on our winding dragonfly-like paths, is how you ended up sitting here as an exorcist, as someone who's, recording courses for us in Emmaus Academy, writing books, spending, in addition to pastoral ministry, spending a significant amount of your time, working on God's behalf to defeat Satan.
I think I'm here because God put me in this place. I always think that in anything we do in life, if we're true to God, then that's what we'll do. A lot of times people ask me, why did I become a priest? And I always say, because it's what I believe God wanted me to do. So 14 years into my priesthood, my bishop tapped me on the shoulder and said he wanted me to be the exorcist for the Archdiocese of Indianapolis. So I'm now in my 18th year of doing this.
Born and raised in Indianapolis.
Yes,
Yeah.
I'm one of 9 children.
Okay.
My mother was a convert.
Okay.
Now, she never liked the word convert because she said it was rather harsh sounding. So she said that she was always Catholic. She just didn't know it.
Oh, like an unfolding of what was already there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so
Okay.
And what was she previously?
just a kind of independent Christian church where she attended growing up.
So big family, mom comes into the church. What was the faith? Was it a vibrant faith life in your family? Was it sort of culturally Catholic? Was it, for that seed of the priesthood to be planted?
I think the church was always central in our lives.
Yeah.
We all attended Catholic grade school. We went to Catholic high school as well. We were always around the church, knew all the priests and the nuns that were there. So the church was just very much a part of our daily lives.
Did you enter seminary after college?
After high school, I went to Indiana University for 2 years. I had thought about becoming a priest, but didn't really pursue it. And then after 2 years in Bloomington, Indiana, I jokingly say that conversion is possible, even in Bloomington, Indiana. So after 2 years, then I decided to pursue that calling to the priesthood. I went to St. Minory College in southern Indiana, operated by the Benedictine monks. And then I finished college. I did first year theology, and then I quit.
The seminary?
I left.
Stop.
I thought, well, maybe this isn't what I'm supposed to do. And then after 2 years out of the seminary, I decided to quit running away from God and just kind of said, okay, if you want me to do this, I'm going to do it.
Was it the study? Were the studies themselves, was it too, what?
No, I enjoyed all the
Academic?
studying and
Okay.
I enjoyed all of that. I just wasn't sure that I was meant to be a priest. So then after 2 years out, I went back. I went to Motherline Seminary in Chicago, and then I was ordained in 1991.
So, I'm thinking about this because, you talk about you have all these, 14 odd years you were a priest before you become exorcist, and you're an exorcist after. Now, obviously, part of the ministry of exorcist is ordered primarily maybe to other people, right? But how has it transformed your own priesthood? Like, how would you walk into just saying a mass, or giving a homily, or hearing an ordinary confession on the 3 o'clock in the afternoon on a Saturday? Like, how is that, how is this one dimension of your priesthood then kind of unfolded or animated, yeah, that's a nice word, the rest of your priesthood?
I think being a priest, is a challenge in the world today. There's fewer priests. Priests are called to do many different things. And the temptation would be to see priesthood as an occupation rather than a vocation. And for me, the word vocation means a calling from God. We do what we do because we believe God has called us to do it. And I think that the role of exorcist has helped me to solidify priesthood as a vocation.
Do you see, so people always ask me, as a psychologist, you walk in, you introduce yourself, say what you do, and they say, oh, don't analyze me, right? And I'll always sort of jokingly say, like, too late, I wonder, but I do notice that I think maybe quietly I sit back and I pay attention to dynamics, like interpersonal dynamics or ways people hold themselves, when they talk, how they talk. I sort of pay attention to these things. I don't always comment on them, but I may be more sensitive to them just because of my training and my vocation. Do you notice that as an exorcist? Does some part of it change the way you see normal things, interactions between people, TV, movies?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think the role of exorcist has put me more in tune with the brokenness that people experience in their lives. It's not just from the demonic, it could be just the ordinary circumstances of people's daily lives and the brokenness that they have, which is why even as a priest, I always tell people when they ask me something, I always want to say yes, but I say, you need to help me get there. Because ultimately, I think the goal is to let people know that they matter, that they're relevant. A term that I like to use is that the church needs to be about grafting people onto the body of Christ and not ripping them off. And I think a lot of times people with their brokenness may not believe that there's a place for them in the church. They don't fit in. And so as a priest, I want people to know that everyone does matter, even with the brokenness that they may be experiencing in their lives.
That's beautiful. I think, without getting too far afield, I think identity is such a hot button topic these days. And I think sometimes we can try to carve out unique identities for ourselves and find more and more niche identities to make ourselves feel special and valued and unique. And but to say something like the church is a place where we should experience and feel that the church should graft us to herself, and we should feel that uniqueness, and that we don't have to go creating it in order to be valued by the world. We can experience it in the church.
And I think that's exactly what Christ did during his life. He always wanted people to know that they mattered, even in the midst of their pain or brokenness. You think of the woman caught in adultery. He met her where she was. And I think today, the church, for it to be relevant here in this part of the 21st century, we just need to meet people where they are. It doesn't mean that we accept their brokenness or their sinfulness, but we just accept them for where they are, and then we help guide them along to a better place.
Nice. Because some people listening might think, well, you're condoning then their behavior. To say meet them where they're at is to say you condone what they're doing, and that's not what you're saying. You're saying,
because even Jesus, like the story of, again, the woman caught in adultery, he says, neither do I condemn you, go and sin no more. He recognizes her dignity as a child of God, and then wants her to see that. And then once somebody recognizes their own dignity as a child of God, that should give them the desire to want to change and overcome the sinfulness in their life. I always say that as a priest, don't do something to please me. Make a change in your life to please God.
And it seems like there's a trust, right? And that if you think of like that story with the woman caught in adultery, or any of the biblical stories we look at of like sinners who've been converted, that when they receive love, it's like this whole attempt to forge an identity, to like create a narrative that's going to be appealing to other people, that's going to find a place for you. It begins to fall away because they don't need to do that. So it's not like they need to have it beat over their head that like you're an adulterous woman, right? She didn't need to be literally stoned for that to like sink in. It's like if she has the contrast of the love, then it's like an invitation out of the self-creation, the self-forging, all that kind of withers, and they don't need it. It's like Jesus says, the one who's forgiven much loves much, right? When the woman is anointing his feet, right? And he's chastising the other dinner guests.
Yeah.
But it's like the person who's forgiven much knows that they're loved, and so is able to, come around in a way without having to be constantly reminded of their brokenness. I think we're all pretty aware of our brokenness. And there's a kind of, maybe not always, but I think that's maybe getting a little trickier now when people's brokenness is celebrated or something. But I do think in general people's conscience is still there. I've noticed that with my daughter. She's only 8 months old, and she already knows she's doing things she's not supposed to. I look over the other day, and she's crawled across the room. She learned how to crawl a couple weeks ago, and she's chewing on her older brother's sneaker. And I go,
Better than his leg.
Margot, what are you doing? And she just turns with this guilty look and puts it down. And I mean, she's 8 months old, but she's already had this sense of yeah, I probably shouldn't be chewing this.
That's great.
And you think it's there. It's even at 8 months old, it's poking her, it's prodding.
Yeah. There's an interesting lab at Yale. Paul Bloom has a lab, and he's been really interested in looking at morality in children, very, very young children. And so he has some really interesting studies that suggest that children have a pretty basic concept of right and wrong at an incredibly young age. And I think this maps onto our idea of conscience pretty nicely. A little empirical validation of conscience, Father, we're talking about brokenness. We're talking about your role as a priest. I mean, this maybe gets us into some of the role of Satan and evil in contributing to this tremendous fracturing and brokenness of our world, of our culture, of ourselves. Maybe for the sake of just laying some groundwork, in your book, you really nicely help give some definitions of things. Could you tell us a little bit about, you make a distinction between, in 2 different chapters, the extraordinary action of Satan and the ordinary action of Satan. So what is that distinction between the ordinary versus the extraordinary action of Satan?
I think the goal of Satan in general is to fracture, to break, because the goal of the Christian life, I believe, is to bring a sense of unity or cohesion to our existence. And ultimately, we find that in our relationship with Christ, that the devil is the one who's always trying to break that. And it can be done in one of 2 ways, the ordinary activity of the devil or the extraordinary activity of the devil. The ordinary activity would be how the devil would try to trip us up in our daily lives through temptation. And I always say he has a 4-stage plan of attack. It begins with deception, which leads to division, which leads to diversion, which leads to discouragement. So deception, the devil gets us to buy into a lie. Once we buy into the lie, it leads to division. We find ourselves broken. And then when we're broken, we either try to justify the brokenness or we look for a way apart from God to try to deal with it. And that's diversion. Something takes its place. But because the human person has the innate desire for God, when we do not give God his rightful place in our lives, I think ultimately there's a sense of being hollow on the inside. And that leads to discouragement. And I think that's what most of us deal with. Now, there is extraordinary demonic activity, and most of us don't ever have to worry about that. But demonic infestation, I think, again, there's 4 types. Infestation, which are the presence of evil in a location or associated with an object. There can be vexation, physical attacks, obsession, mental attacks, and then possession itself, whereby the devil would take control of a person's body, treating that body as if it were its own. And why would the devil do that? It's his version of the incarnation. The devil wants to mimic God, and he believes that by possessing a human person, he's taking on human form himself.
We don't have to go here, but as a psychologist, I'm utterly fascinated by the idea of obsession and how we begin to distinguish what might be, and I think I see this sometimes with folks I talk to, students, clients, how do we distinguish what is sort of the normal processes of the mind, which can, in a fallen world, easily sort of get caught up in having intrusive thoughts or thoughts that come in that are unwanted, but sort of pressing in all the time, sort of focusing or perseverating on something almost obsessively. How do we decide, or determine rather, what is sort of a normal, maybe broken, naturally broken process of the mind versus what is an extraordinary activity of Satan?
I will say that demonic obsession is probably the most difficult of the 4 types of extraordinary demonic activity to deal with. Because as you suggest, we are dealing with the human mind. And that's why the church would always rely on experts in the mental health field. But I think trying to determine whether or not it's something of a mental health issue or demonic, a good thing to ask would be, are these thoughts internal, coming from within the person, or are they external, alien to that person? And I think if they're alien to that person is kind of under siege, if you will. And that may lead credence to the fact that it's something demonic. If it's coming from within, it's internal, it may be a mental health issue.
Do you see a certain kind of vulnerability, like where maybe those are coupled? Like, do you find that people who are struggling with an existing mental health issue are then more prone? Like, do you see any kind of correlation to where, like, they're layered, or does it seem like just utterly disconnected?
I think most exorcists might tell you that, is it 100% mental health? Is it 100% demonic? And I think most exorcists will say there may be a combination of both at play, such as did the person experience a demonic episode that may have caused the mind to fracture as a way to try to comprehend it.
Right.
Now, I worked with a gentleman one time. He was diagnosed as being schizophrenic, and his priest asked if I would talk to him, which I did. And he certainly was not dealing with the demonic. It was a mental health issue. But I didn't want to just say, hey, it's not demonic, be on your way. So I arranged a meeting with him, his psychiatrist, and caseworker. So the four of us were sitting around the table together, and I told the man, in my opinion, you are not possessed. And then the psychiatrist looked at the man and said, Father says you're not possessed. What is your response? And it was interesting what he said. He goes, I'm disappointed. And then he said to the psychiatrist, you can tell me that I'm schizophrenic, but you can't tell me why. If it's the devil, I have my why.
And you can get rid of it. It's a little easier than medication or therapy or whatever the elaborate years long. I mean, you know more about that than I do. But
That was just a very profound response.
That is. So I sometimes wonder, or I see in my students, when some tragedy happens, there's a shooting, there's a terrible killing, I'll hear people say, that's utterly demonic, or he must have been possessed, and I oftentimes think that is our way of trying to distance ourselves from the evil and the brokenness that is sort of naturally within us, that we're capable of. Sort of to say, well, no, he must have been possessed because a human couldn't be capable of that. And I want to say, no, I think we can and we are.
That's why we should never say the devil made me do it. Because, the devil can propose, but he cannot impose. We still have free will. You think of the story of the temptation of Adam and Eve. The serpent didn't take the forbidden fruit and cram it down her throat. Just presented it.
Right.
She had to make the choice.
Does that hold even at the level of a full possession, Father? So it seems like there's certainly free will. There are a series of choices and actions that can get you to the point where maybe full possession occurs. But for the person who is fully possessed, do they still have some freedom or capacity over their will? How does that?
The soul would always remain free.
The soul remains free.
Because that's considered to be the dwelling place of God. Now, ultimately, the devil would try to get somebody, we use the term, to sell their soul. But ultimately, that belongs to God himself. So when we talk about demonic possession, it's always of a physical nature. But something of the person always remains free, and that part which remains free could ask for the help of the church.
I was going to say, that there must be some freedom, otherwise people who were possessed would never come and ask for help, right? If there was no freedom. So the fact that they would come and even ask.
And just because somebody's possessed
freedom
doesn't mean they're manifesting 24 hours a day. To be possessed means that somehow someone created an entry point for the demonic into their life, created that connection. You could say that they entered into the realm of the devil. And so now there is that kind of attachment, and something may trigger that connection to cause the manifestations. But people who are possessed could be going through the normal daily activities of their life.
Would you expect to notice a difference? Would you expect to see some change in the life or activities of the person if they were possessed? Is it something that the average person would notice, or only in the case where manifestation is occurring?
I think people could start seeing signs of it. It's interesting that the people that I worked with over the years who are or were possessed, there's that sense of isolation. They withdraw from God, family, friends, and they're just kind of in their own little world, because the devil likes to work in that notion of divide and conquer. You call
Relationships,
somebody-
yeah, right.
You think of the story
Right.
of the Gerasene demoniac in chapter 5 of Mark's Gospel. Well, he's living in the tombs. He's amongst the dead.
Among the dead. Yeah.
There is no sense of community. He's in isolation amongst the dead. It's interesting at the end of that story, what does Jesus do? Because he wants to follow Jesus,
Yeah.
and Jesus says no.
You make this point in the book. I think this is
Yeah.
great. Yeah.
Go back to your family.
Yeah.
He takes a man that living amongst the dead and puts him back amongst the living, which tells us the importance of healthy human relationships.
Yeah, and like you said, he wants to follow Jesus, but he sends him back to his family, back to community, relationship with, interesting, the living. Yes.
And ultimately, he will follow Jesus, but not in the way that he thought.
Yeah, right.
Well, and it strikes me that the Samaritan woman at the well, right, is a very similar story. She has this encounter with Jesus. She shows up, she grows up, she has an encounter, and then what she do? She's reintegrated. The woman who's coming to draw water at noon in the desert by herself, which is a woman's work that you would have done in a group at cool points in the day.
Yeah, yeah.
Right now, she is going to the community, right? And it explicitly says, like, the people are believing because of the testimony she's giving, right?
Yeah.
And so there is that feature of
Reintegration.
in her case, is an extraordinary, right?
Yeah.
Seemingly. I mean, hers seems to be ordinary brokenness,
Yeah.
right? And not extraordinary brokenness, but the
You
same.
just said she went at noon. It made me think of the noonday devil.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's another name for the noonday devil, Father? What else do we call that?
Acadia.
Acadia.
Well, see, yeah, it struck me when you were doing your list, the nice D's, right? Deception, division, diversion, discouragement. I circled here in my thing, diversion, Acadia, right? And so that is interesting that there's that stage, and I wonder the extent to which that seems like a stage. Like we teach, college students, like they are so deep in the mire of that, and it struck me. I mean,
Yeah, just them. It's not.
no. I'm definitely in it too. But I think I take the opposite end, right? They talk classically, right? In Acadia, they make a distinction between two different forms of the vice of
sure.
Acadia, right? Right. You have like what we typically think of sloth or Acadia, right? Which is like the binging, Netflix or the social media obsession, right? That's not me. I'm the other kind of Acadia. I'm the frenetic activity version, right? So I'm not saying I don't have.
Get up, sweep the cell.
But I think which is the same kind of diversion, right? Which is that you can be caught in that kind of diversion, but instead for me, it's my to-do list. It's the tasks, right? I'm pushing my son on the swing, and I'm looking around the yard. I need to mow. There's a weed over there. There's there's this.
Yeah, interesting. So let me ask that, because when I hear Acadia, right, and I think the ordinary activity of Satan, and I think in your book you have Acadia nested in that chapter, then you can imagine people thinking, okay, well, any vice I have, it sort of rings of, but Satan made me do it. Like somehow, how do we talk about the work of Satan and our vices? My inclination is to say something like, well, these are bad habits that certainly harm my relationship with God and fracture it, but it doesn't always feel like Satan's next to me whispering in my ear.
I think Satan would want you to continue to perpetuate the vice. He wants that to even grow and expand, because the goal of the Christian life would be to grow in virtue. We all struggle, I think, with vice in our lives, but at some point we have to come to realize that virtue is what we're called to. But the devil is always going to be there trying to amplify, if you will. The devil may not be the cause of all of our problems, but he is an opportunist. So if he sees that we're struggling or there's a brokenness in our lives, he may try to inject himself into that just as a way of taking something that's bad and making it even worse.
That makes sense to me. I hear in the background my students talking about sort of bad habits they have and sort of overly spiritualizing them sometimes as a way to maybe step outside of them being the cause of these bad habits.
It's not that different from the example you gave of the schizophrenic man,
Exactly.
right? Where if he can say, I'm possessed,
Right.
then the voices in his head are demons
Right.
and not mental health, right? And I feel like it's just as easy for us, our students, whatever, to...
I didn't get out of bed this morning because, or I fell into excessive drinking this weekend because. They want to point to this clear spiritual cause.
So it's actually a noonday devil that's...
Right, yeah. And as opposed to saying something like, I don't know, I've got these bad habits and I don't quite know where to start or begin. I don't know how to fix them. I don't know how to And it feels messier and maybe more chaotic in some ways to enter the natural than it does to just say, it's spiritual attack. I'm going to say my prayers a little bit more rigorously, and that should go away. I imagine you see this with some frequency, folks who maybe overly spiritualize the natural.
If we try to deflect our responsibility, that's what the devil would prefer. You think again of the fall of Adam and Eve. God is the one who makes the first move. They're hiding. God moves to the garden and says, Adam, where are you? And then how does Adam respond? Well, that woman you put here. Eve, what have you done? Well,
it's the serpent you made.
It's pointing the
We're
finger.
all pointing to somebody else.
And we should do the complete opposite. I always say, can you imagine what would have happened when God said to Adam, what have you done? And Adam said, I'm sinned and I'm sorry. Just own it.
We don't even have any attempt at penance.
Just own it. But we don't. So we always want to deflect it, and that's where the devil would want us to do. When I was in the seminary, I used to read a lot. And I remember this line that I read in a book, and you might like it because of your background. It says, if you try to get rid of qualities about yourself that you don't like, then you declare yourself to be more and more non-existent, and your devils grow fatter and fatter. We may not like the vice in our lives, but it's a part of the story of our life. And rather than running away from it or blaming someone else for it, just own it. Because anything that we can name, we can deal with. Things that we deny, they own us.
I think avoidance of these unhealthy, unhelpful, difficult, painful, negative memories, experiences, I think avoidance causes so much problem in our life.
I think that's why the sacrament of reconciliation is so important. It's not about putting people on a guilt trip for what they did. It's just about owning something.
Radical ownership.
And actually having to step forward and say.
I always tell the children at my parish that going to confession is like throwing up. Nobody likes to do it. But once it's out of your system,
You feel really good.
You feel so great.
Feel better. Yeah. I bet those kids have no clue. Yeah. The father's an extra. Yeah. These very visceral images of puking and.
I'm struck by this. We use the word deflection, I think, and it's striking because related to this idea of the noonday devil, this kind of conversation we have of trying to pray somewhere else versus a confession claiming their own. I mean, within the last couple of weeks, I've received multiple people. They think you're a theologian, so you can answer everything, right? You get all sorts of. I'm sure you get emails and text messages about everything. It's you at counseling, solve everything, just casually, right? But these are good friends. I love them, right? But both of them sent me text messages about generational sin. And I've been seeing more and more, I'm sure you've been seeing this, more and more stuff about this writing about this. But the extent to which, I'd be interested to hear you speak about this, because you write beautifully in your book about authority, right? And I really like that, and hierarchy, whatever word we're going to use. You talked about the Dionysian hierarchy, authority. It strikes me, right? Dionysius, Pseudo-Dionysius also has the work, the ecclesiastical hierarchy. So you tell the story in your book about the priest who doesn't have permission to perform the exorcism, and the demons are mocking him you don't even have your bishop's approval, you can't do anything. But also a parent's approval when you're giving us the exegesis of the Gospel of Mark, right? You have the Syrophoenician woman who can come and actually ask for the healing of her daughter on her behalf. There's a parental authority over the child. So I guess when I think of this generational sin, when we're thinking of authority and hierarchy and those kind of dimensions, that webs of things, to what extent can we, not to deflect, right? That's what I'm worried about whenever I hear generational sin. Is this another deflection technique? To what extent can I actually be spiritually bound or spiritually affected or spiritually chained and in need of some kind of deliverance or liberation from prayer or retreat or ministry because of the divorce of my parents or because of the alcoholism of my grandfather?
Let's get into it. I like this.
Or that, my great-great-great-grandfather owned slaves, which they didn't because we were dirt poor, pig farmers. But I guess those sorts of awful things that people point to and then think this is why these things are happening.
I think it's a danger to think that somehow we're just poor victims of those who came before us. We should never believe that the sins of others become our sins. So you can grow up in an alcoholic home, an abusive home. Now we can be impacted by that sinfulness, but being impacted by the sin and saying it's ours, because it almost sounds like then we're just born into this cycle that we can't break out of. And that's certainly not what Christianity is about. We can break out of anything because we have the power of Christ with us. Even in exorcism, that's what the basic message is. Okay, you may be possessed, but the power of Christ is greater than the power of the devil. You can break out of that. There is a sense of hope that we can have.
Yeah. Okay. So to muddy the waters, if you will. So on one hand, there's an interesting, when we think about baptism and we think about our ability as parents, sort of on behalf of our child, bring them into the church and introduce them to the graces of the church. But you talk in your book about a woman who was dedicated to Satan by her mother. Her mother did not want her. She was dedicated to Satan. And that type of example sort of doesn't sit well with me, precisely because I think to myself, well, she didn't have the choice. She didn't have the freedom to choose. And the parallel there, though, is much like a parent has the authority over their child to have them baptized, and sort of to choose on their behalf initially. There's sort of a negative image here of one could dedicate their child to Satan, and then this person has sort of been opened up or had some attachment or whatever the language might be, against their will. And there's something in me that revolts against that, or I dislike. Although I like the positive image, which is I can give my child this entry into the graces of the Catholic Church through baptism. I don't like the flip side of that, because the child doesn't have any freedom and is sort of this victim or plaything of their
But
parent.
I think even when that child was dedicated to Satan at birth, it wasn't that God abandoned the child. God was still with that child, even through all the midst of all that darkness. I think of Psalm 23, even though I walk through the valley of darkness. Depending on the translation of that psalm, I like the word through, because it lets us know that the darkness is not permanent. When people believe the darkness is permanent, that's when they lose hope. But obviously God had to be with that young lady, because if you know the story again, at the age of 12, she left that environment. She knew that it was alien to her. And then she ended up on the streets of Rome, found her way to the priest who was training me. The demons are cast out. She becomes a nun. So to me, yeah, there was a lot of in the midst of her life and what she went through. But God was somehow guiding and directing all of that. And maybe a good line to use would be, Satan was cast out of heaven, but he wasn't cast out of creation. He still has a role to play. Now, the role he plays in the ugliness that we see, we may not like, but we're looking at kind of just a small little snapshot, whereas God can see the bigger picture.
So I mean that seems like that's very extraordinary, right? Because that's like this like explicit kind of like satanic ritual almost aspect of like dedicating. But like, I mean, you know what I'm talking about, like generational sin.
I always define it as, my view of generational sin is something like, when my sins, brokenness, right? I create an environment or relationships that are unhealthy, and so the people around me, say my children, learn to cope with the brokenness I bring in unhealthy ways. And so they then adopt unhealthy coping
Sinful diversion.
And it sort of comes out in, so it's not so much like I sin and then it just like rolls into my children, but it's I'm failing to provide safety, security, comfort, soothing. I'm hurting and harming them in ways, and they're reacting in the best way they might know how, but through negative, so they start cutting, or they start drinking, or they start using drugs. So it's a relational reaction, an unhealthy relational reaction to my sinfulness, which is its own sinfulness, which they'll then pass on to their kids because their unhealthy coping. So I think of generational sin in that way.
But it's more of a secondary response.
I think so.
Right.
As opposed
You're
to
not attributing it to like this direct like
metaphysical. It's not a metaphysical or ontological,
sure.
like I've sinned and then that's somehow.
Yeah. Because I think that's how some people perceive it, right? It's like when people want to be
how they
delivered, or
talk
that's at least
about
the
it.
language about it,
Yeah.
right? And it's not. I've not read a lot of this. It's more like people in the milieu seem to be talking more about it. And
Yeah, you know, somebody, a dear student friend of ours, showed me an image. She had a really difficult past, chaotic and abusive, and so she drew a picture of what she thought trauma looked like, her image of trauma, and it was a picture of her parent holding a broken heart and handing the broken heart to her. And I thought that was an incredibly powerful image, and that's how I think about generational sin. I take my brokenness and I hand it to you because it's all I know how to do. I don't have that integration, that cohesion, that wholeness. So I just hand you my brokenness in some way. And as a child, all you know how to do is receive what your parent gives. And so you take my brokenness, you take my unhealthy ways of coping, of interacting, you adopt my anger. I model for my kids how to act. And if I'm modeling unhealthy, sinful behaviors, oftentimes a child will adopt those or see those. And so I think about maybe generational sin like that, me handing on my brokenness.
I like that image of handing the broken heart. Goes back, I think, to what we were talking about earlier, like the woman caught in adultery. You hand the broken heart to the church, but there's healing. Yes. So is the brokenness perpetuated, or does the brokenness come to an end through healing?
Father, it strikes me, you are, as much as people might think, okay, exorcist, darkness, chaos, demons, you are, I'm struck by the fact that you're actually the man of hope. You're the man of it's not the man weighed down, it's not the dark man, it's not the man, you're the man of tremendous hope. The exorcist is actually the person with the greatest hope. You see the healing, you see the answer, you stop the cycles.
Well, my focus is not on the devil.
Yes.
The focus is always on God and what God wants to do in people's life. And it goes back to that image again. God wants to heal the broken heart. The devil wants to take that broken heart and break it even more. And that's where the cycle of sin is perpetuated.
And who believes that more? Yeah, who believes that God wants to heal the broken heart more than the exorcist?
And that's, the image of the prodigal son. You can say that when he returns to the Father's house, he has his broken heart in his hand, and he gives it to the Father, but he says, I've sinned against heaven, I've sinned against you, I no longer deserve to be called your son. The Father listens to the broken heart, but he doesn't break it more. He brings the healing. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet, bring out the finest robe, and kill the fattened calf. I don't care where he's been. All that matters to me is where he is.
How do we learn not to be afraid of the brokenness of others? I think a lot of people I'm just destroying the set as I lean into it. I think a lot of people are afraid of the pain, the suffering, the hurt, the traumatic experiences of others. You obviously learned somehow to not be afraid of others' brokenness. And I think sometimes that's what causes people to maybe recoil.
I think people recoil because when you look at the brokenness of others, it may challenge you to look at your own brokenness. And if you haven't dealt with that, it's like looking in a mirror, and it can become so uncomfortable that you want to run away.
Sounds like parenting. Yeah. I'm like looking at my son, I'm like, that's me.
Dude, I will never forget walking up the stairs to give out to my oldest son about the way he was talking to his brother. It was so ugly. It had so much ugliness in it. And I walked up and I said, so-and-so, how dare you talk to your brother? And as it was coming out of my mouth, I was like, oh, I see where this came from. That's me. I heard myself, right?
So, you talk about how it's, you're focusing on Satan, it's on God. We talked earlier about, I was mentioning your sensitivity, like, do you see things differently? Do you notice people? I'm kind of curious now just about, your sensitivity to the other dimension, like in the good dimension of this, like the angels, the saints, etc. I remember Charles Taylor has that massive book, A Secular Age. I don't know if you've ever bothered trying to read this massive tome. No. You need to read the first chapter, and then the rest of the book repeats the first chapter. Hold on. But one of the things I love about the book, it's one of these great secularization narratives where he's trying to explain like how we got here in a, secularized world. But one of the things he puts his finger on most is a sign of secularity, because he's trying not to talk particularly about like de-Christianization. He's trying to make a more macro scale observation. It's just like all of human history until recently had this deep sense of a spiritual realm, right? All like just anthropologically, if you look at human beings, they think they think our material world is permeable to a whole nother world that's far greater, vaster, more powerful than our own. So I guess one of these things is maybe, I think a lot of people have almost a macabre fascination with the demonic. I'm sure like book sales and YouTube videos and whatever else that talk about that. Even amongst Catholics, there's like, and you even talk about that, like you don't want to sensationalize it, And I really appreciate in your book that you're not like trying to give us like the most dramatic Hollywood-esque presentations. And I'm sure there are Hollywood-esque things that you may have seen. But you're not putting that in the forefront. Is like, to what extent can you speak to just like the permeability of our own world to the saints and to the angels, and it's not just God, but there's like a whole spiritual realm that we're being uplifted by. We're not always just being torn down ordinarily and extraordinarily by demons. There's an ordinary and extraordinary intervention of holy beings.
Sometimes the evil seems more clearly noticed than maybe the
right. Or what I think we have is we have this battle that's like God on one side and then like armies of demons. And it's like God by himself.
Yeah.
Right. It's like God, maybe Mary. Like and she's right here with God. And then armies of demons. But it's like there's a whole lot more going on.
Yeah. Hierarchies of angels.
Yeah, hierarchies of angels even.
I think of that line in the second book of Kings where it says, there are more for us than those who are against us. And that leads to our Blessed Mother, the saints of the church, the angels. Even if you think about the fall of the angels, 1/3 of them fell. But that means 2/3 didn't. I may not be good at math. But I do know that 2/3 is greater than 1/3.
Yeah.
So if you think about that, the devil really is nothing to fear. Because ultimately, when I was a kid, so I have 6 brothers and 2 sisters. My brothers, we used to like to go outside, and of course our parents wanted us to go outside, get out of the house, go run the neighborhood.
Yeah, the golden age.
But we used to like to turn over rocks and catch all the bugs and all the slime and everything. Sure. But if we turned over a rock and we didn't put it back in where it was, what would happen to all that area of slime? Well, the sun would hit it, and it would all dry up, and then grass would grow and whatever. So wherever the light of Christ is shining, the slime of the devil eventually will dry up. That's why I always say that the devil is kind of like a cockroach. If you go into a house where there's bugs,
the second you turn on the light,
you flip the light on, what does the bugs do? They scurry for every crack and crevice. They prefer the darkness. And so in an exorcism, the church is throwing the light of Christ onto the evil. And again, it's not just a matter of casting the evil out. God has to be invited in. I would even suggest that casting the demon out is the easy part. But to convince somebody to invite God in, that's a challenge. Because I think a lot of people today are asking the question, who is God? I think a lot of people today grew up with a distorted image of God. I like to ask children to draw me a picture of God, because I'm always interested in how they view God, because we get older and somehow God is one to be feared. Where does that image of God come from? Because ultimately, the image of God should be one of unconditional love, that we are all created in the image and likeness of God. We have great value and dignity, not because of anything that we did, but simply for who we are, that we are God's children. But I do think when I look at the world today, I think one of the main problems that we have is that we have a distorted image of God that seems to permeate society. And only when we rediscover an authentic image of God will, I think, we start to see a sense of cohesion in unity in society, and not all the brokenness that we see everywhere today.
Yeah, it strikes me the prodigal son parable you mentioned earlier captures that so well, right? Is he even having this loving father? I mean, in the story, there's a very good father apparently in the story, right? I mean, but even then, he's got his rehearsed speech. He's just going to be a servant in the home, right? And so even when he does, I mean, have that, he's not able to enter into that, right? I mean,
but he's caked in filth.
Yeah.
Can you imagine? I mean,
he had to be disgusting, yeah.
Disgusting. But the father kisses him, puts his arms around him. I mean, how many of us, if the odor or stench of somebody usually repulses us, we want to get away. But God does the complete opposite. Doesn't run, he runs towards us. That's why I always say that Christianity is not about our search for God, it's about God's search for us.
And just letting ourselves be found in the process.
And that's exactly.
Stop running away.
And even with being caked in all the filth. Because God can look beyond the human person caked in the filth of sin and still see the beauty of that person. If you have a jewel and it's dropped in mud, it's still a jewel.
Still a diamond, right?
It's still a diamond.
Yep.
It may need to be washed and cleaned up, but it's still a diamond. It still has great value. And that's the human person. And I think in the ministry of exorcism, that's one of the things I try to convey to people. Yeah, you may be caked in the ugliness of what the devil is trying to do in your life, but there's still something of great value underneath all of that. I may see it, but I have to help that person see it for themselves as well. It's not enough for me to see it. They have to see it as well.
Yeah, do you think, gosh, I have so many thoughts. I have all these thoughts about maybe one reason that people are fascinated with the demonic is because sometimes what we experience of God is the hiddenness of God. But you have these sort of instances maybe where the demonic pops or jumps out, or these stories that, and they feel more real and more tangible sometimes than the hiddenness of God. And so people will latch onto it as some acknowledgement that the supernatural is real. It feels so, God's quiet hiddenness, sometimes the still small voice feels less real in some sense than maybe the dramaticness of Satan on occasion. But that's actually not where I wanted to go.
But even when you're saying that, though, what I'm thinking of here, though, is the other thing that strikes me is like, you were talking about God has cast Satan out of heaven, but hasn't cast him out of creation. I think the other thing that fascinates people, or maybe pulls people, to the occult or these things, is it's this worldly, right? Like the encounter with evil seems very much in this dimension. Of course, Satan's goal is about the next life, but these manifestations, these encounters, versus God and his hiddenness often is pointing us, almost always pointing us away from this world, right? We're pilgrims on this earth. This earth is not our home. This creation needs to be recreated and transubstantiated in a way that we can't even imagine in the new heavens and the new earth. And so God's trying to pull us out of this, right? It's like, and you have that trajectory so clearly in the Old Testament, right? Is that you move from God with a really intimate, powerful manifestations, even with Moses, right? You think at the beginning, Moses has got fire and lightning and everything's on the top of the mountain, but that's actually not the most intimate experience with God. As like by the time you're talking about, like in the book of Numbers, when it's complimenting Moses, right, where Miriam and Aaron try to rebel against Moses, the compliment it gives to God rebukes Miriam, and the Miriam ends up being leprous, right, for a while. But the rebuke he gives is that Moses talks to me face to face, like one man would talk to another. And that's like the highest claim, right? That's like intimacy. The fire and the lightning and everything cool in the mountain, that's pretty low grade.
Yeah, it requires a certain sign. We talked about Father Boniface Hicks last week on prayer. I mean, one thing that struck me, hopefully tying this all together, is he talked about how sometimes prayer can be difficult because we have a distorted image of God. We view God as like our fathers, or like this divine, sort of wrathful finger on the smite button waiting to get us. But that we have to move past that into silence, into vulnerability. It's an interior movement, whereas some of the demonic stuff feels exterior and concrete, more real.
Noise permeates our society today. We always have to have something going on in the background. The Archbishop of Indianapolis, who appointed me, Archbishop Daniel Beekline, he passed away a few years ago from cancer. He was a Benedictine monk from St. Meinrad. He was the rector of the college when I was there.
Was he
I was
really?
wondering.
Yeah.
And then he went on to become Bishop of Memphis, and then he came to Indianapolis. So
I love that thread. Yeah.
So
There's a little dragonfly.
when he appointed me, obviously we knew one another. But in all of that, Archbishop Beekline used to say, the church has more than enough vocations to the priesthood that it needs. The problem is that young people today cannot hear the voice of God because it's drowned out in the noise of this world. So you can say that even in an exorcism, maybe a good analogy is that the church wants to turn down the noise of the devil so that the voice of God can be heard.
That's sort of a seamless segue into entertainment. There's a couple sort of big topics that oftentimes you kind of hear parried around and talked about among the laity. And I'm curious your take on. So one is entertainment. I mean, the types of movies, music, books we should be reading. I mean,
Letting our children read,
like Harry Potter, like hip hop music. What are these things and how do they work? I mean, is it as if I watch Die Hard 2, right, with Bruce Willis? Let's go to Die Hard 1. Let's go to the classic Die Hard 1. I watched Die Hard 1, right?
Why would you watch Die Hard 2?
Why would you watch 2? You go to Die Hard 1. It's sort of violent. There's revenge. it's not as if, right, that like some portal to hell opens up and I've just entered a pact with Satan. I hope. Right? Is it? Right?
Now you're worried.
Yeah. How did the movie, the types of things we...
And see, the thing I would do
yeah.
with the entertainment industry,
Yes.
rather than going there and looking at all that it has,
Yes.
I would say to the person, tell me about your relationship with Christ. Because I think there's a danger in trying to see the devil everywhere. But does one have a good, solid foundation in Christ?
Do you see the first part again? Where you're an exorcist saying, I think there's a danger in trying to see Satan everywhere.
Absolutely.
That might surprise people, yeah.
Because again, I mean, our goal should be to see the presence of God everywhere.
Right.
So if you want to enjoy a movie, but do you have that grounding in Christ? Are you a godly man? Are you a godly woman? Does God have his rightful place in your life? Like Harry Potter. If you tell children, don't read those books, don't watch the movie, what are they going to do? They're going to read the books, they're going to watch the movie.
And they're going to be wondering what you were hiding from them. What about this was supposed to be scintillating?
Why is it so...
So I always say to people when they say, well, Father, what do you think about Harry Potter? I like to respond with another question. And my question is this: which do your children know better? Can they quote Harry Potter more readily than they can quote Scripture? And I said, if they can quote Harry Potter more than the Bible, there's the problem. But if they know the Bible well enough that they can read Harry Potter, then they can filter Harry Potter through the Word of God, and they can see where it's inconsistent with our teaching. So even certain types of literature, entertainment, can be teachable moments for us if we can filter it through our faith. The danger may be if people don't know their faith, so they read all this stuff and watch all this stuff, and all it does is pull them further and further away.
It edifies me for a very personal reason, because the other night I watched Gladiator with my 16-year-old son.
What a wonderful movie.
In a sense, right? I mean, I remember watching it when I was a teenager, just being like, whoa. But I mean, it's violent, it's, there's an element of revenge, it's ancient Rome, there's gentle overtures of incest, right, with Caesar and his sister. And so I was able to sit with my 16-year-old and filter it through sort of the true moral grounding. And so we were able to hopefully see it for what it was, that there's sort of an honorable desire in this man to get back to his family and to avenge a certain injustice, but where does he go too far? Look at how corrupt ancient Rome is, because they don't have, right, faith in the one true God. So I think it was able to be that, hopefully, for him.
It's a teachable moment.
Yeah.
We can take anything the devil is doing to us and use it to our advantage, because the devil only attacks where he believes we're weak. But if the devil has allowed us to see a weakness in our lives, then we know where we need to put in some more effort to shore that up, to grow in virtue rather than growing in vice. So take what the devil is doing and use it to our advantage.
No, you have this little book here, which I'm fascinated and I want to talk about. Because why I'm thinking about that is at the same time as you're saying, okay, Harry Potter, if you can quote the Bible more than you can quote Harry Potter, then you know how to filter Harry Potter, maybe while you read it or watch the movie or something. But it seems like there's also a line, which is why that book is coming to mind, is like, and that may not just, like, so we can talk about that because that's talking about New Age, right? Things that are clearly crossing the line. But there's like a gradation here at some point where you don't want to say, no matter how much you're reading the Bible, you don't want to watch that, you don't want to read that, you don't want to do that.
There's a bright line somewhere.
Right, somewhere the line gets brighter, right? We can have a gray area, but then there's a bright line somewhere. So, I mean, I don't know if you want to speak to that work in particular or what the church has given us.
I've never heard of this work.
Yeah,
just put it on this table. I've never heard of it.
To tantalize us with your rare book, then I'm going to go pay $100 for a $3 paperback on Amazon. My wife's going to be like, what happened to our credit card bill?
Yeah,
Father Lampert.
It was the exorcist who told me I had to have it, right?
Going back to the entertainment industry, the danger with all of that is that the demonic plays on a person's memory and imagination. So we can put all these thoughts and ideas in our head, and we're giving the devil fuel in our lives. Now, ideally, we would read the Word of God so much that we would not want to read Harry Potter.
Yeah.
That would be the ultimate goal.
We just,
It wouldn't even interest us. We'd start reading it and we'd find it
It wouldn't interest you? Because I think the goal of any Christian should be to root out of our lives anything that is inconsistent with our faith. I think a lot of people today are, it's kind of, you're in, at the buffet or whatever, and you're looking at what you want, and people may be grabbing things that are inconsistent with our faith. And at some point it'd be like, I think I'll put that back, or I don't need that.
Or it becomes such a lesser, even as a form of entertainment. I'm thinking about putting it maybe in relational terms. The deeper I grow in love with my wife, the more I want to spend time with her, the less I'm distracted by other things that I might, like want to go in the basement, want to go fly fishing. It's like you come to love somebody so much that they occupy your thoughts, your mind, your heart.
And that's what you were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
They come to love God so much that anything that is not of God no longer has a place in their lives.
And I think the narratives that capture this, right? There should be a point where, like, for all the heroism that Harry Potter or Dumbledore have in the narrative or something, I should be just more fascinated by St. Francis. And, like, I don't know, like, so it's not just the scriptural story. I'm thinking here of, like, the lives of the saints, or like these things, like, like that these should, like, these
but we
are
may
real
not
narratives.
even know the lives of the saints. That could be the challenge.
Right.
I think that's why, St. John Paul II canonized more saints than any other pope collectively, because he believed that we needed modern day examples.
Modern heroes.
Of what it means to live the Christian life. And if you read the lives of the saints, they weren't perfect people. They just came to terms with their own brokenness and invited God into the brokenness, and God became that healing power, if you will, that brought the pieces together.
Do you find particular saints helpful in your ministry, that either you ask for their intercession on your behalf, or you like entrust people to, like, you're really, not even say possession, like, they're just struggling with, oppression or something, right?
Do you use your saints? Like, do you use saints that are particular to you, that you love?
Or like they're baptismal saints? Like,
or they're objective saints who...
Some saints better than others.
Yeah.
Like, what I really want is a rank, right?
Yeah.
Because, I'm a Franciscan, and I want to know that St. Francis is better than St. Thomas Aquinas.
How dare you? How dare you? Our Thomas brethren are dying right now.
I think each exorcist may have their own collection of favorite saints.
Can I guess yours before you say? You strike me as a St. Therese guy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
I'm wondering about Peter and Paul too, man. He's got a Peter and Paul pen.
St. Peter and Paul, very powerful.
Yeah.
I like St. Gemma Galgani.
Interesting.
St. Rita of Cascia.
These beautiful young women.
St. Padre Pio.
Oh, wow, yeah.
St. John Paul II. Blessed Bartolo Longo.
Oh, interesting.
Some may not be as familiar with him.
Yeah.
Right.
How did you become familiar with him? And
how do these saints make how do they gravitate to you? Or you gravitate?
They are saints that did battle with Satan. There's I discovered a new saint just a couple of weeks ago, one I had never heard of. A 7-year-old boy named Servant of God, Manuel Fedora. He's called the Child of Light. And I had an exorcist friend says that he has a picture of this servant of God. And when he showed it to a demon, the demon couldn't look at his face because he was radiating the glory of God. And the demon said, the light is blinding me.
There's something beautiful about the innocence of a child too, the sort of the childlikeness of a child.
Absolutely. So there are very powerful saints.
JP2, are there stories about him did he do battle with Satan? Is there any?
He did an exorcism in St. Peter's Square.
Really?
Yeah, there's a story about a woman who was possessed who was brought to him. I believe it was after one of the Wednesday audiences, and then he did the exorcism there in the corner of St. Peter's Square.
I'm just thinking, they actually apostles, right? I mean, St. Peter has this kind of massive authority spiritually. So, I mean, JP2 is an inheritor of that.
Another one is St. Catherine of Siena. She's one of my favorites too.
Why is that?
She cast demons out simply by walking down the street. She would radiate so much the glory of God. She didn't use a formula, or she didn't even have to say anything. She's just kind of like.
See, I love this example you're giving of servant of God.
I wish
the little
this is what I'm aspiring
the 7-year-old
after,
boy,
right?
servant of God, Manuel, St. Catherine, like, these are lay persons.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the beauty, right? I mean, we look at Padre Pio and JP2, and I think that's, Padre Pio's got the stigmata for 50 years. He's pretty amazing. He's
outside
like
my realm.
He's like getting thrown around in cell by Satan, and I'm here on my smartphone like, Acadia all day. I don't need to be thrown around the room. But like the hope of maybe just being holy enough to like smile with the light of Christ.
Yeah.
So I think people are searching for something, and we can find it within the church, not outside the church. You know, the book that you were talking about that I just read, Jesus Christ, the bearer of the water of life. This was put out by the Vatican 20 years ago in 2003.
So I guess it's under JP2 too.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's a reference to, in John's Gospel, the woman at the well, that we are all in search for something, and everything else will not satisfy us. Only Christ can do that. But I think people are longing today, and this book is about the New Age, where people believe that somehow Christianity no longer has anything to offer. So we need to ask, what is the next thing? And to me, it's suggesting that when people believe that Christianity doesn't have anything to offer, it means that they've never delved into Christianity. So people may have that label of being a Christian, but they don't live it out. They don't really know what it means.
I know a lot of people who maybe are agnostic or atheist or something like this, or Christian in the loosest, vaguest sense of being Christian, but they're fascinated by crystals and horoscopes and tarot cards. And they think that if they could just ask you the question, like, what's your zodiac sign, they'll be able to, like, I won't even answer this question for these people anymore because I don't want to, like, give any credence to the system or whatever. Like, what is it about New Age? Because you're right, like, I mean, they're looking for something. They're looking for Jesus. And maybe it seems more straightforward, like, when you think of, like, the 7 deadly sins, like how people look for God and lust or power or whatever else. And maybe that's just my vices or something, right? But what is it about the New Age that...
I think the New Age echoes the words of the serpent to Eve. Basically, you don't need God. You are God. And a lot of the New Age, I think people are fascinated by crystals and all this stuff because it's somehow the focus is on them. Somehow it's finding the God within yourself.
And it's self-creation. It's like, I mean, I'm struck by how much of this New Age stuff is about manifesting. Like, if you commit yourself to thinking, you hear athletes and people talk about this stuff, like, I dreamed this scenario into existence. I'm thinking, no, you also like train for 10,000 hours to be a professional basketball player, and you're 6'8", and you have like the greatest gene pool in the world. That might have something to do with it, right? But they have this assertion, like when you talk about self-creation, this temptation of Satan, right? I've always been struck, right, that when Eve sees the fruit, one of the things that's listed when Eve sees the fruit, right, in Genesis 3, is that it's desirable to be like God, which you always think is a very strange temptation because she was created in the image and likeness of God. But it's like, I can take this fruit and I can be like God, but I can delete God out of the equation. I wonder if that's New Age. It's like, I'm manifesting this. It's like, instead of it being Facebook or social media, like in my real life, if I use these New Age things, I'll become the person I want.
And the key word is I.
Right.
I. There's the focus is on self. There's a sin of pride. Years ago, I had a lady in my parish. Her college son had stopped going to church, and he was graduating, getting his degree. And she says to him, would you come to Mass with me today? You're graduating, and just thank God for all that God has allowed you to achieve in your life. And she said he looked at her and said, God didn't do any of this. I went to school, I went to class, I studied. This is all about me. God had nothing to do with getting me to where I'm at in my life today.
It's interesting. So maybe I'm hearing you guys talk and I'm thinking there's a perversion of something that we are called to, a certain divinization, that when we enter the beatific vision, we will be made like God.
We'll judge angels, Paul says.
Right? But like, so maybe part of the New Age fascination is it's a perverted foretaste of the truth that we're made for. That in God's, this tremendous grace and gift of God, that when we behold His face, right, we'll be made like Him. This process of divinization that occurs. It's a perverted expression of it because I give it to myself, or it comes from these crystals or these cards. But it's not this gratuitous gift of God making me more like Him. It's me making me more like God.
I think that's a danger for exorcists, is that we should not have this elevated sense of pride in our own lives. I never want to believe like I am the expert in the room. I may have something to add to the conversation, but I don't believe that what I say is definitive. It's like the question, which is more efficacious, the old rite in Latin or the new rite in English?
Even about the exorcistic rite you're talking about.
Because exorcists, well, people have this debate. Early on when I was appointed, I remember another exorcist saying that he was using the new rite and the demon manifested and said to him, "You're not going to try to get rid of me with that translation, are you?" And so then he said, "Well, I don't use the new rite anymore because the demon said he didn't like it." And so then I raised my hand and I said, "But if the devil is the father of all lies, why are you listening to a demon?"
Right.
So when somebody tells me,
That's fascinating.
like
yeah,
the
that's a
debate
great
in the
argument.
church,
Yes.
which is better, the old or the new rite, Latin or English, I just say, I think
That's
the devil is happy
fantastic.
that we're having this conversation. Because all that does is show division within the church.
And it pulls us away from the authority,
Yeah,
right? The authority of just the
absolutely.
church, which I loved about the story you told. I've mentioned already this time about like needing the bishop's permission to perform an exorcism. It's not like, is the bishop holy? Is the bishop traditional? Is the bishop progressive? It doesn't worry about all the church politics. It's just like, he's the bishop. He's a successor of the apostles. He has the jurisdiction. Geography actually matters in the spiritual realm.
Yeah.
Really?
People, it comes out in your book, but people might be surprised that while Satan feels big and scary and chaotic, and the demonic is very juridical. I mean, it's incredibly law-based, right? I mean, it's all circumscribed by laws and rules. And so there's authority and hierarchy and words, but that he really doesn't have the chaotic freedom that he
Absolutely
manifests.
not. He's on a chain.
Yeah.
So
Wow,
the
yeah,
devil is not free to do what he wants, only what God permits. If the devil had free reign, the world would be even more chaotic than it already is. But he's kind of on a chain, and the question is, if the chain only allows him to go this far, think of that dog that's chained up in somebody's yard, and
He's a
you're
big
walking on the
Rottweiler,
sidewalk,
yeah.
and the chain comes right to the edge of the sidewalk, and the dog is barking at
We've got
you.
a few of those in our neighborhoods.
But the question is, as long as we stay outside of how far the devil's permitted to go, we have nothing to fear. The danger is when we enter into his realm, and then he's able to reach us. And the challenge would be to stay outside of his realm, to avoid these things that we do that may create that entry point for the demonic in our life. We're all sinners. We all do things that are wrong. So if we do something that's wrong, again, own it. Go to confession. Give it to God. Even Father Gabriel Amorth, the former chief exorcist in Rome, he passed away back in 2016. He always said the place to begin with anyone who believes they're dealing with the demonic is to tell them to go to confession.
The sacraments are more powerful than an exorcism, right?
Absolutely.
It's important for people to know that. The sacramental life of the church, go to confession, receive the Eucharist.
That's why even like spiritual warfare prayers, I always say to people that spiritual warfare prayers, at least in my opinion, we all know, again, exorcists all have different opinions.
Yeah.
But I
Love
think
to hear this.
spiritual warfare prayers should not become a part of somebody's daily prayer routine.
Because
It's
some
like a
people I know won't
prescription.
begin a holy hour without them.
Yeah.
To me, it's like a prescription. You may need it for 10 days to address maybe something really strong that you're trying to fight against. But eventually, go back to the sacramental life of the church. Recognize the importance of going to Mass and praying and reading the Bible and living and knowing your faith. I think the danger of getting fixated on spiritual warfare prayers is that the focus is too much on the devil. I need to say this because the devil's going to get me today.
Yeah.
And that's certainly not where we should be.
I will say, I agree, and I feel I'm always a bit leery, admittedly, when people are really into spiritual warfare. I oftentimes feel like then I end up being the heretic who, it's not that I don't believe in it, I do, but sometimes I get the sense that actually focusing on spiritual warfare is another way for people to feel, not everybody, so I don't want people at home to hear this the wrong way, but it's a way to feel a certain kind of power.
Yeah, I wonder if there's
authority.
semi-Pelagianism about it.
Like I have this power over the
I
spiritual
got
realm.
enough tools.
Yeah, I just worry. I like to hear, and it does give a lot of credence to the evil as opposed to focusing on God and God's love and the sacraments, grace of the
We don't have to do anything extraordinary to defeat the devil. The ordinary aspects of our Catholic faith will put the devil on the run.
I think that's what people need to know. I think people have a lot of fear. There's a lot of anxiety, right? And there's this fear of like, okay, when I start my holy hour, I know, being at Steubenville, real charismatic world going on there. And people have like these things of like, if I'm going to pray for someone, they're worried there's like, you'll hear people talk about like spiritual contagion. Like, I'm going to pray for this person who's dealing with these real wounds or these, like, is that something people should be afraid of? Like, if I'm going to pray for this person, I need to like pray protective prayers before I even pray for this person or something. Is that like, or are these just driven by fear? Is that even like a...
And fear is never a good place to be, because again, the devil operates on fear. And we need to root fear out of our lives. That's why what the devil is doing, even in the things that I see, I'm not afraid of any of it. Because I know the power of God is greater than the power of the devil. And what the devil is doing is really just a facade he's putting on, this charade. He's making himself more than he out to be than he is. You think of the manifestations, like the deep voice, if you're mad at somebody, what do? You raise your voice and you try to drown out everyone else. So the demon is just trying to act like it's more powerful than it really is, and that it's in control. And it's meant to instill fear. I think that's why people are fascinated by the manifestations when somebody is possessed. But again, fear is no good way to live.
To touch on another hot button topic that I'm thinking of as we think of fear here, is it just struck me, we talked earlier about media and what we take in, like horror movies, or like even exorcistic movies. Like these kinds of things that people should be taking. Some people are really, these are good Catholic people I know, they're really fascinated and they want to watch documentaries, or they want to watch, even Hollywood productions that suppose, people tell you, oh, well, there were a real exorcist involved in the production of this movie or something like this, like the original Exorcist way back, Like, is that kind of fear, even, you could talk about exorcism movie, or maybe the fear of even just, your normal Halloween movies, or...
Should we be afraid to watch those movies?
Or should we just not want to take them in because we're reading the Bible more?
Yeah.
See, for me, I just choose not to take them in.
Yeah.
I tell people that I like to go to the movies every 10 years.
Yeah, except the thing, though, it's second rate for you, though. It's like you could watch a movie about exorcism, but you just did one on Friday night, right?
Yeah.
It's always a step.
Well, that's the challenge, being a parish priest, because I'm a pastor of 2 parishes. Saturday morning, I could do an exorcism, and then a wedding or a funeral, and then I'm into Saturday evening Mass. Yeah. So putting one hat on and off. Somebody joked and said, make sure you don't bring the exorcism to the wedding.
Or maybe you should.
Actually, you might need it. Sir. Yeah. Well, before you guys say your vows, let me...
Oh, I love it.
Yeah.
What do you think? You mentioned, this is something that strikes me. So you said earlier that Satan can use our memory and our imagination. And I can imagine this being a real sticking point for folks who are scrupulous, or something that could make people scrupulous. I will admit openly here that maybe more than I'd like to admit, but I don't feel particularly ashamed about it. I probably think about punching somebody in the head like 3 times a day,
Make a note of that.
He's getting ready for his exorcism now.
That's right, yeah. He's just mumbling under his breath. I'll be walking down the street, right? And maybe, I don't know, a strange thought will pop. I'm like, gosh, what if I just knocked the coffee out of that guy's hand? Or, somebody won't hold the door for me, and I think, gosh, I should just slap them upside the head. And I don't feel tremendous angst, or I'll sort of think like, oh, what a strange thought, and just let it pass. But you could imagine getting fixated on that and being like, Satan put that thought in my head. Oh my gosh, he's...
Yeah.
Now, okay, I shouldn't think that. And there is this sort of psychological principle where the more we try to not think about something, oftentimes there's this rebound effect and it comes back with full force. And so now you've got yourself in this cycle of don't think about slapping that guy upside the head. And all I'm thinking about now is slapping that guy upside the head. And so what do we do with this, that Satan can use memory and imagination, but also if I just let my mind run, all sorts of wild and fantastical and weird and just kind of come and go. Is that just me? Or...
I think it goes back to what I said earlier, is that internal or external? When you have that thought, are you able to say, this is alien to me, this is not who I am? And then there may be some demonic component to it. If it's just something internal, then that's just a part of our own whatever makeup that we need to deal with.
Yeah.
Even in the world of exorcism, somebody who believes that they're possessed has to have some type of a mental health evaluation. And oftentimes people will hear that and say, well, Father, that means you don't believe me. I'm like, well, the reality is, if it is demonic, you need to be in a good mental place before going through the rite of exorcism. And ultimately, I always like to say that the priest, the doctor, and the psychiatrist should be working together, looking at a person's situation, because ultimately there is some brokenness there. Is it spiritual? Is it physical? Is it mental? Is it a combination of, some of these? So working together to get the person the true help that they need.
And I imagine after an exorcism, sometimes maybe there's pieces to pick up.
Absolutely, and that's
therapy
why
or something could be
therapy
really
is so important
Yeah.
in all of that.
Yeah.
So do you only work with therapists and psychiatrists who believe in the demonic?
Not necessarily,
Oh, that's interesting.
because I don't want them just to validate.
Yeah.
So it has to be an interesting
Sort of
working
healthy
Because
skepticism, right?
Well, because again, as an exorcist, I'm trained to be a skeptic. The church says that I should reach moral certitude beyond the doubt the person in front of me truly is possessed. So I want to rely on the experts in the mental health field, medical doctors.
That's awesome to know.
And I'm not asking them, do you think this person is possessed? That's why the psychiatrists, they could be a non-believer.
But they're
I'm
just trying to do
basically-
their best psychiatric
Yes.
evaluation.
Is there something about this person's condition that is outside of your scope of understanding? So the church herself will make the determination whether or not somebody is possessed. But again, the church wants the best possible information. I like to say that I believe the church would do greater harm if it labels somebody as being possessed, and that label
Incorrectly.
prevents that person from getting the true help that they need. Because I'm publicly known, I get about 3,500 people a year who reach out to me.
And how
The
many
majority of
exorcisms
them-
do you end up having to do it?
Yeah. How many of those would actually be full? Very rare. Right?
Very rare. Some people, I refer them back to somebody in their area. I network with a lot of exorcists all over the country, even other parts of the world. I can't work with everybody who reaches out to me, but I can try to connect them where they are. But the majority of people have already self-diagnosed. I'm possessed.
Yeah.
I need an exorcism. And my response is, I don't know if that's true or not. You may be there, but I have to get there. You don't just get to come in and hand me a prescription and say, I need this filled. I need to make that determination myself.
You mentioned training. What is the training to become an? So the bishop taps you, which I imagine is a wild experience to begin with. Hey, are you busy? Right? You're going to be
For the rest of your life.
You're going to combat Satan openly. What does that training look like?
When I was appointed back in 2005, I became one of only 12 designated exorcists that were known in the United States. The Archdiocese of Indianapolis has always had a priest in this role. So that exorcist, he died in July of 2005, Monsignor John Ryan. He was the pastor of the parish where I attended grade school.
Did you know he was an exorcist when you were there at grade school?
Kind of, because he would tell stories.
All right, kids.
Like he used
Be
to
good.
He used to have this
Don't play Ouija boards.
this old oil drum in the back of the rectory, and he would burn stuff in there. He said one day he was burning these tarot cards that he went to see somebody, and he would take these things away from people who were trying to clean up their spiritual lives. He said he was burning them, and they started flying out of the fire one at a time. He said he just went quietly on the back porch and closed the screen door as the cards were just flying out one by one. But when he passed away, the priest, we were all trying to lie under the radar because we thought, the Archbishop looking for a replacement. I was planning to be on sabbatical in Rome in the early part of '06 at the North American College, and I was on some committee and for the Archdiocese, and we were having a meeting at the Archbishop's house, and I was running late. So I arrived at his residence, and I'm walking through the dining room to where the meeting is taking place. Well, the door opens on the other end of the dining room, and the Archbishop walks in, and he looks at me and says, I'm appointing you to be the exorcist for the Archdiocese.
That casually.
That casually. Here, I'm running late for a meeting. I'm
yeah.
trying to get in there. And he goes, I'm appointing you to be the exorcist for the Archdiocese. And I actually looked behind me to see if there was somebody else behind me.
I love, though, in that story, you've got Monsignor Ryan, who was at your grade school.
Yeah.
And then you've got the bishop, who is your rector at the seminary.
Mine read the first go-round.
Yeah, you have all of these sort of interweaving
We know the other
threads.
interesting thing, St. Anthony Grade School. Right across the street was the old Central State Mental Hospital in Indianapolis. And there was a city park that shared a fence. So we had recess
Next to the mental.
in that city park, and the residents from the mental hospital would speak to us during recess. So we would go up and talk to one another. So.
Was that the 60s? What year? Was that in the 70s?
The mid-70s.
Mid-70s.
It is amazing.
Different time.
Yeah. Can you imagine
Just a little chain link fence?
That's all it was,
Yeah,
a
just a chain link fence. Yeah. Yeah. And
A different world.
it was a different world.
So there's the exorcist, there's the mental health component.
Yes.
There's my archbishop stalking me.
All of it.
The archbishop even said to me, he goes, I have no idea what I'm asking you to do. He goes, we've always had an exorcist, and I don't want to break the streak.
That's a beautiful sense of tradition,
He
though.
goes, I don't have any idea what I'm asking you to do.
So what was it? So what was he in effect asking you to do? I mean, you go somewhere?
Well, he said, you're going to be in Rome on sabbatical, so while you're there, go ahead and study this too. Now let's go to our meeting.
Did he even tell you who you were going to study with, or was that up to you to find
No.
your friar mentor?
So I arrived in Rome, and so I
looking
talked
for an
to,
exorcist.
I went to the rector, because I was living at the North American College, part of the sabbatical program. So I talked to the rector, and I go, can you guide or direct me? Well, he directed me to Father Gary Thomas.
Oh, sure. I've talked to Father Gary, yeah.
He was in Rome on sabbatical. He was studying, training to be an exorcist. And then Father Gary Thomas says, well, I'm working with this Franciscan priest. Let me ask him if you can come along as well. So then Father Carmen de Filippis, he allowed me to mentor under him.
Now, is there a formalized course of study to become an exorcist? They say,
No, once,
it's just
once the bishop says, you're it.
you're it.
And so
Tag,
that's
you're it.
it really is just at that point. It is the apostolic authority of the bishop that, in some way, imparts that.
Luke's Gospel, chapter 9, verse 1. Jesus sends out the 12, and he gives them authority over all unclean spirits. So the authority is with the bishop. So once the bishop said, you're it, I was it.
But then I guess what I'm wondering is, in the church, do they give, once they've tapped you and given you that authority, is there a sort of standard training that exorcists would undergo? Like, you're going to read these 5 books and then you mentor with somebody? No, you just learn through
I think that we have some of that now, but it wasn't when I was appointed.
So you just learned with Father Carmen de Filippis.
Father Carmen de Filippis. He was trained along with Father Gabriel Amorth.
They were students at the same time.
They were students of Father Candido Amentini. He was a Passionist priest who was doing exorcisms at the Holy Stairs in Rome, near the Basilica of St. John Lateran. So at the very top of the Holy Stairs, there's a chapel. There's a bust of Father Amentini in there today.
Is that who that is? We were just there
That servant of God.
this summer.
Yeah, I have a picture of him on my phone, but that's him. I always imagine, think of these pilgrims crawling up these stairs, this great devotion on their knees. Father Amentini died back in the 1990s, but can you imagine crawling up the stairs and he's doing an exorcism and you hear these howls and screams and you're on these stairs thinking, I wish these people in front of me would get out of my way.
Hurry!
I imagine that's what
It's
it was
like the
with my
ladder of a
4-year-old
that
or something.
icon, you know the icon of the ladder of Satan where the demons have
demons
hooks
are
and they're
pulling
pulling people
people
off the
off.
stairs. That's my image. I guess.
So Father Carmeni and Father Amorth would go there and they mentored under him. Because Father Carmeni had a stole that belonged to Father Amentini that was framed in the room where he did exorcisms. And so...
A relic.
Yeah. So you learn this through watch. I mean, it's passed on in some sense, the authority of the bishop, but then you watch. You watch. I mean, so you just participated. He would say, hey, I'm going to do an exorcism today.
It's like an internship. You know, you can go to medical school and you can read and learn, but when you actually do hands-on is when you really...
Get your mask and your gloves and go in the surgical room.
Does he hand it off to you at some point? So he's doing these at first, you're watching. At some point, does he say, you're going to take the lead and I'm going to be there?
No, he took the lead
all the time.
Your view.
I went about 3 days a week. So he was pastor of St. Lawrence outside the walls. So I'd walk down from the North American College to the Fountain of Trevi. Around the fountain, there was a bus stop. Burger King was right across the street.
Yes. And Roman
America.
the Roman bus
I'd
system.
get on the bus, 15-minute bus ride out to St. Lawrence. There's the church. I went in, the first time I went into the church and I prayed. There was a courtyard. The first time I went there were about 50 people in the courtyard. Some had appointments to see him, some didn't. Some were already manifesting. They're like howling and whatnot.
In the courtyard.
In the courtyard. Even the woman had been dedicated to Satan. She was standing there manifesting.
How old are you at this point, Father?
How old was I?
Yeah. I mean,
I was born in 63, so I'm
Okay.
60 years old. So this,
you would have been
40, early 40s.
Early 40. Okay. I was just imagining like a 25-year-old walking into the courtroom being like, what has my bishop gotten me into, you know?
Still feeling that in his mid-40s.
I imagine you might, though.
And then there was a little cluster of buildings, and then Father Carmine had his office in there, and I'm walking through the courtyard, and I'm looking at the scene thinking,
excuse me, so I'm so sorry.
What in the world is going on? What am I got myself into?
Yes.
And Father Carmine greets me. He spoke no English and didn't know one word of English. I studied some Italian, I know some Spanish, and we kind of
cobbled it together.
We made it happen.
No, so like in that mentorship process, I'm fascinated by mentorship because we've even talked about this. Like, he's in charge of teaching excellence at the university, so he's supposed to make us all better teachers. And one of the things we've talked about is mentorship, right? Before, so I'm actually curious about this. So like, you have this right, and then do you sit down and talk about it afterwards? Does he like coach you on? You see how I had to, like, get the demon to reveal its name to me, or do you see how I like evoked these saints, or did he like? Was there like?
No, it was just me watching and observing. One of the exorcisms, for example, the demon gave the impression that it had been cast out. And again in Italian, but the demon was saying, "Thank you, Father, for praying today. I'm much better now. There are so many people that need to see you. You can stop praying. There's no need to continue. I'm okay now. You can stop." And Father Carmine just kind of stopped and gave this inquisitive look. He picked up his holy water and blessed the person again, and the demon goes, "I told you could stop." So he knew that the demon was giving the false impression that it had been cast out. So
then you filed that away.
I filed that away because exorcisms that I have done, one of the things I noticed that when a demon is cast out, there's a glow about the person once the demon is gone. And it's hard to describe the glow, but think about a halo around the person's head, a saint. They're not radiating their own glory, they're radiating the glory of God. And that's an indication to me when there is this kind of glow that the demon truly has been cast out. So I'm watching him, and this is again thinking, okay, make sure the demon isn't hiding. But I'm taking all of this in. Another exorcism, I set in on 40 when I was there. I would go about 2 or 3 days a week.
Over 3 months, right?
Over 3 months.
Okay.
He did more than that, but those are the ones that I fit in during the time that I was there. Another one, the demon started causing the body to levitate and rise. I'm kind of looking over there, and I'm seeing this body slowly rise out of the chair, this hideous, horrible look on the face of the demon, and this kind of grinning at me, and then the rising up. And Father Carmine has the rite of exorcism in one hand, and he's praying, and he kind of looks over, and then he just takes his hand and puts it on the head of the person and goes, boom, pushes him back down in the chair.
Unfazed.
Unfazed. He did.
Smoke and mirrors. Yeah.
Yeah, I was like, okay, I wonder what I'm having for lunch, or it's like, I'm
That's
not
the right
impressed.
attitude. Yeah. And that is the right attitude, right? I mean,
But again, I took that in.
Yeah.
Don't get fixated on the theatrics of the demonic,
Theatrics.
but to stay focused on what God wants to do.
Yeah, and it strikes me as a story. I was just thinking of you saying that, like the wonders, or what we call the plagues that God performs in Exodus, right? The magicians perform many of the early plagues, right? Like they can turn staffs into serpents, they can turn water into blood, but then they kind of get out of their element. Yeah. And then they can't compete anymore. But it's just like don't be fixated, don't be wild, right? Like it's just kind of
I like that word, the theatrics of Satan. Yeah. Father, advice for folks so that we don't get fixated on the evil, so that we stay focused on the glory and grace of Christ. to live the kind of life that we're called to live so that we don't have to worry about Satan, what would your practical advice be? Because this is so rare. I mean, the sort of thing is full possession is so rare. How should we be living? Just
The first thing I would say is that the devil has no power over us that we don't give him.
That's good to hear.
So if we give him the opportunity to be present in our lives, he's certainly going to be there. The image I have, based on your question, I'm thinking in the book of Revelation, Jesus is standing at the door and knocks. But we have to open the door and let him in. So it's really about taking our faith seriously. I'm thinking of that painting again on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, the story of creation and God floating on the cloud in the shape of the human brain. The finger of God is stretching out to Adam. And what's interesting, if you look at it, Adam's finger is still kind of bent. God's is like this. So God has done his part, but Adam needs to straighten his finger out and to make the connection. So the question might be, what can we do to straighten out our finger to make the connection with God? And once we have that connection, the devil's nothing to fear. And that connection is simply living out our faith in the ordinary way. Again, I think sometimes people are always looking for the extraordinary. I jokingly say, somebody comes to me and says, Father, I'm dealing with the demonic. I say, great, pray and go to church. And they look at me like, I'm crazy.
I like
But if I were to tell them to do something extraordinary, like
It's
to
the
go out
Naaman story.
go out at
Yeah.
midnight,
Yeah.
the next night of the full moon, and hop on one leg and howl at the moon,
Wash in the
and
water.
swing a dead cat around your head, and go, where do I get the cat?
Yeah.
We're always willing to do the extraordinary, but it's the ordinary. It's the day in and day out, giving God his rightful place in our lives.
Do a morning offering, say night prayers.
Pray, go to Mass.
Yeah.
And I love that the Samaritan woman, to go back to the image that this document from the church gives us, is the Samaritan woman, she's just drawing water. Like her encounter with Jesus is like in the most boring, ordinary task.
God meets us where we are. When I was in seminary, one of the Benedictine monks at St. Meinrad, he made this statement and it always struck with me. He said, prayer is a come-as-you-are event. Just pray from your own experience. Just pray right where you are and whatever you're dealing with, and just give it to God.
I think we have to be somewhere first before I can go to God. I got to clean up I got to get right, and then I can approach him. And it's approach him from where you are.
No, it's the prodigal son again, covered in filth. Just go to God. God sees the beauty within. We need to see the beauty within ourselves. And I think that's what the church and our faith ultimately is helping us do.
Father, it's been an absolute pleasure having you.
Thank you so much. This has been an absolute delight.
Yeah. For just shedding light again, what strikes me is that you're the man of hope. The exorcist is the man of profound hope, which is
And the humility. I mean, I've appreciated too just that there's a real openness to just.
Thanks for drawing.
Wearing the black suit and the black hat and the black briefcase, walking in the shadows.
Right. But radiating hope, which is this beautiful contrast, right? You bring light into those dark places. And thanks for drawing out the drawing flame.
Your own life.
Your own life. All those beautiful providential moments where the Holy Spirit sort of animated your path, even in grade school where you didn't know what was going to happen. Here you
Next
are.
to the mental hospital.
Next to the mental Oh, I love it. The 70s were wild. I love it. But thank you so much.
Yes, my pleasure.
If you've liked at home, we hope you did. Please subscribe for more great content. And Father, again, we're incredibly blessed to have you. And keep bringing hope and light to those dark places.
Amen.